So first of all, thank you everyone for jumping on remote. I know the weather's pretty bad. We have a couple of people here in the office as well. This is, first of all, thanks for joining a Wisconsin UX meetup that we have here. We do this monthly. Last month we had a Dribble meetup. Before that, we've done everything from user journey mapping to UI kit and design system discussions. This is going to be our first Figma sort of workshop in a 4-part series, 3 or 4-part series, kind of going from everything that we're going to learn today, which is more about the Figma UI and kind of how it works, all the way up to building a prototype out that we can actually test with users. So first of all, I'll introduce myself. My name is Billy Sweetman. I'm a design lead here at Headway. I've been doing design work for roughly, 7+ years, I think. My background, I originally started in the game design field, doing video games, and then eventually got into web design and product design kind of along the way. Started most design stuff in Photoshop, so used that originally, and then Sketch a lot, and then finally we moved to Figma here at Headway just because of its collaborative capabilities. So as I'm kind of going through this, we'll kind of take some breaks along the way. Hopefully everyone has Figma installed so you can kind of follow along with me. Figma's free for up to 3 personal projects, and you can just download that at figma.com. So you can actually get in there and kind of follow along and work through stuff. Every once in a while I'll stop and take a short break for questions, which Andrew will kind of be checking out in the chat. So I'll probably just stop, pause, ask Andrew if anyone has any questions. So I can just kind of keep going, and then he can relay any of that stuff to me. So, all right, cool. So first things first, this is Figma here. If you can see my screen that I'm sharing here. Figma is broken down into a couple of different components and sections. This is already in a project, in a untitled project. What you probably originally start out with is something that looks similar like this. This is sort of the project browser that Figma has. And the personal one, you will see probably just one of these, kind of like personal here. You can see we have some other projects here, and then your individual files in here. You're allowed 3 projects on the personal account. And then within that project, you can have as many design files in there, at least as many as, I think it's as many as you want. We have not found the limits of that at all yet. So when you go and create a new file, it'll jump you right into a draft untitled because it doesn't know where to assign it right away. Just so when you do that. Over on the side here, you're able to search all your files, and you kind of see the recent files that you worked on, any drafts that you currently have. So like my untitled one is a draft here, and any deleted files. So actually, I'm going to backtrack a little bit. Once we get all said and done, hopefully we'll have everyone kind of work through a simple portfolio design like this. We'll be kind of going through the structure of the actual prototype, the different screen designs, and the components that we use along the way to build up that design. We'll be kind of talking through in future talks the nested components, how to set up hover states, prototypes, everything like that as well. So just kind of give you guys a preview of what we hope to build out as a group. So if everyone wants to go ahead and create a new file, you can go about and do it in 2 different ways. You can create a new file in your new project by hitting this new file here, or if you just hit the plus sign up at the top here, where you see Intro to Figma and Untitled, you'll go ahead and create a new file in a draft project. And it will go ahead and load. So Figma is connected to the web, so every time it's loaded, it's refreshing everything to the web. And that's one of its really powerful elements, is allows other people to jump into the files with you. So there will be a little bit of loading here and there as we go through things. So you'll notice it'll be in drafts right away. You can go and select, if you click on drafts, you can select where you want to place your file. If you have a project already created, if you just want to keep it in draft, that's fine. And then selecting on the untitled will allow you to give it a title. So just call this Figma Workshop 1. And we'll just keep it in drafts for now as we kind of work through it. So we're kind of going to go over the interface and kind of work through each component individually. And then I'll stop and see if anyone has any questions after we get through the first one. So the first component we're going to work through is our left navigation. This left navigation here is your page browser and your layers and sort of assets and other elements, components will show up in here as well. So pages are, if you've used Sketch before, you can create multiple pages in a single file. Similar principle here. You can have multiple pages. You can have really as many as you like. You can name them however you want, and each one of those has its own canvas, and you contain its own elements within it. Underneath there is your layers panel. Right now we don't have anything in our layers panel, so I'm going to name this first page just workshop. And if I were to create something in here, and we'll kind of go through creating different elements later on, but you can see that it adds elements to the layers panel here. So your layer panel can get pretty complicated. Your groups, your components, everything will be stored in there. You can click on any one of those elements to rename an item in your layers panel. So you just double click on it. You can rename anything to whatever you want. So we name rectangle card and name our text title, which is really beneficial when other people are getting into your file or you just want to keep track of what it is that you're currently building out. This middle section here is the canvas area. So each page, like I said, has its own canvas. The canvas, right now we don't have anything in it except for two objects. The canvas will contain everything from your groups, your frames or artboards, to all your different objects, and it really is pretty expansive. And there's a lot of space in here to work with, so you can actually we have some pretty complicated designs laid out with lots of screens in there, so we've got a lot of room to work with, place everything in there. And then our right panel over here is your design, prototype, and code panel, and we'll kind of go over that in a little bit more detail as we get further along here. So does anyone have any questions right now? And I'll go to Andrew since he's monitoring the chat. All right, and we will keep on going. Move this. All right, up top here, then we have sort of your top navigation as well. So in your top navigation here, you have your project browser, which will take you back to all your different projects. Any projects you have open, the individual files within that project will also be stacked up here in a tab flow as well. You can have multiple Figma browsers open at one time, which is very nice if you wanted to be able to look at two different screens side by side, and you can do that in the File New window, so you can get a whole new Figma window if you're working on things side by side, which is nice when you have to reference things or work through things there. Over here we have our Tools menu. So each of these tools, we've got sort of the Move tool, which allows you to grab objects. That's your default tool. V is the shortcut to get to that and allows you to grab and move objects around. We have our Frame tool, which is F, which allows you to create frames. And as you can see, I've got a frame here in my canvas, and this actually allows you to put objects inside it and almost act like a group, for example. Your next tool here is your rectangle tool, or this is really all your basic shapes are contained under here. So you have rectangle, line, arrow, ellipse, polygon, star, or place an image here. Some of those shortcuts, like R gives you the rectangle, O gives you the oval, or the ellipse. Similar shortcuts than, I believe those are the same as Sketch, and I think Photoshop as well. I know V is the same in Photoshop, and but R is not. So. Then you've got your pen tool here, and this pen tool allows you to create what Figma has is their vector networks. We'll kind of go over that in a little bit more detail later on, but that's sort of like your vector tool. We use that a lot for creating icons across the, really on everything that we do, or creating unique masks or shapes that we might need. And then You have your text tool, which is T, which allows you to put all your words into your designs here. Pretty straightforward there. And the last one is comments. So you can press C, and this is really helpful when you have a lot of people in your file and they're leaving comments. You can at certain people, no one's in this file. I can at Andrew and say, how does this awesome box look? And that'll post directly to him. Well, I'm not sharing it with him, so. Actually, you know what? I'll bring Andrew in so he can you can see him. All right, so now it's shared. So now you can see Andrew might come in here and start moving around a little bit. We already talked about where your project and your file name is, so we won't kind of go over that too much up at the top here. These icons up in the top here, you'll see Andrew just jumped in. So this will tell you everybody who's in the file. You'll see up to 4 users, and then anybody after that will be a numeric icon. We've had up to 20-some people in one file at one time, so it can get pretty robust, the amount of people that's flying around in there. There are some tools if you want to turn off other people's cursors. You can do that as well. Oh yeah. If any users in your file, you can double click on them and you can follow them around, so you can actually watch what people are doing. This is a great way that if somebody's presenting and you're not doing a screen share, everyone can kind of jump in and just follow somebody as they're kind of talking through a process or talking through a design to avoid a screen share scenario. Or as other people are working through things, you can quickly jump to other people. We've had multiple designers in a single file at specific spots, and during a presentation, we just don't jump to them as they're presenting, stuff like that. Does not work in the prototyping area, so when you're viewing a prototype, can't follow somebody there. And that's this little play button here, which is called present. Share button just allows you to share with other people. It's just simply invite them via email, and you can set if they can view, if they can edit. Is it a public embed, which if you're doing any integrations into Jira, you have to have your files as a public embed, otherwise Jira won't consume your Figma boards. So that's just a little tidbit to know there. Then over here you have your view settings. View settings allow you to set up things like pixel preview, the pixel grid, allows you to change some nuance in the way like your vector tools work, like if you want to snap to the pixel grid, and if you want to be able to view grids across the board. And then this is the multiple cursors, so you can hide other cursors in there. Then the last setting up top is sort of your zoom factor, so it just shows how zoomed in you are. Right now Andrew is 25,000% zoomed in. Just kind of show where you are. And then the final icon is the team library. And the team library, we'll get into this a little bit in some later sessions, but this really allows you to start creating really robust UI kits and pull in elements from one file into another file. So not everything is stored into a single file, and you can start to build out. And these can be shared cross projects. So it's something we do a lot with sort of universal UI kit that exists above a bunch of projects, and then we can bring it into multiple as we need it. Well, cool. Any comments, questions so far? Good? All right, cool. Then we'll keep on going.
It looks great so far.
Giant X. Then the panel over here on the side is, like I said, the design, prototype, and code panel. In this panel, you have a bunch of settings. So I'm going to stop following Andrew. So if you don't have anything selected in the design panel, this is your default canvas controls. So it allows you to set up a couple of things. If I had local styles created, they would show up here on the side, and we'll go through that a little bit later on. Also allows me to set some generic export settings across the board, turn on pixel preview, turn on pixel grid, and also change my background color. So if you don't like the default gray that gets back here, you can switch this to be whatever you want, which depending on what kind of design you're doing, this is a real great red for background. But it allows you to just kind of adjust the background to make your design pop a little bit more, make it a little bit more legible, especially if you're doing a lot of like naming out different things and adding title and kind of designing within the canvas a little bit. We do adjust the background quite a bit for what we have there. If you do have something selected, you will have all the object settings in here. So every object will have a bunch of settings that can be adjusted and manipulated, and we'll kind of go over those in detail as we go through those, but that will be in your design panel. The prototype tab will contain all the controls for the prototype. So if you're linking multiple screens together or multiple objects together, it'll allow you to choose the trigger. Is it a click? Is it hover? You'll be able to choose the action. Is it dissolve in? Is it an instant trade out? Is it a card that like a modal that's floating over the top? You have some capabilities there. And we'll dive into that a lot deeper when we get into the prototype stuff. And the last part is the code section. So this will give you a little bit of code either in this sort of table view or the code view, and it gives you CSS, iOS, and Android styling options. Not as robust as some other tools, but it does kind of give you a little bit of groundwork for some information there. So in the canvas here, we can create a bunch of things and start to build stuff out. So here I'm going to delete all of this stuff. And we're going to start with our simple square here. And we'll kind of adjust the size here. So when we create objects here, another little canvas control, spacebar and mouse. This is pretty standard in a lot of tools, but allows you to move around to different objects. Also, if you have something selected and you just hit Shift-2, it'll snap you right to the object you have selected. So this is kind of a neat shortcut when you have a million objects in your field here and you find something and just press Shift-2 and it'll snap you over there. So when we draw out the simple shapes, we get a bunch of capabilities and controls that we have within here. We have its position coordinates, we have its width, its height. Does it have any rotation on it? Does it have any quarter radius? So I can set this to like 8 and it'll automatically round it. Set to 10, give it a little bit more of a corner radius here. Then I also have some layer controls. This is a little bit more of sort of if you like some of the styling options that Photoshop had or has. So this gives me things like normal, pass through, I can darken, I can do color burn. So if you're ever doing like some photo treatments, get a couple options here. Use luminosity quite a bit with photos in a background there. So you can really change a way your layer behaves and actually renders out with all these different options here. And this gray on gray isn't super great, but I'm showing the difference here. You can set the opacity of a layer as well. So when you're creating different states, you can set it to 20%, 30%, and build up some overlays for there if you wanted to have some different styling options there.
Quick question in from Jeff.
Yeah.
If I have multiple objects that I'm stacking.
Question from Jeff here. If I have multiple objects that I'm stacking in a page, similar to when coding an HTML page, does that need to reside in one frame, or can I just have multiple layers on the canvas like in Photoshop?
So when we build most of our UIs, everything exists. Everything is really frames, and we'll kind of dive into that when we get to frames. But really, it's really frames within frames within frames within frames, because every component is contained with a frame. Frames has a lot of capabilities, like allows you to do clipping controls. Frames gives you all the different sizes, like your paper sizes, desktop sizes, tablet sizes. So really, you can just have things floating around, but frames is the way to go, especially when you start componentizing elements, because it'll keep everything collected into a nice little container, much better than groups. Groups are out, frames are in.
So I think there's also a distinction between an artboard and...
Right, like you're creating an artboard or a group and then a frame.
Yeah, so really you have your canvas in the background here, and then you have your frame. So normally I wouldn't be floating and building stuff just on the canvas like this. We would normally start with a frame and work solely inside this. So here we could say button, and then we would change this to be like the background. And then within the frame, you can actually collapse it down here, so I can have everything sort of grouped underneath it. So yeah, we'll dive into frames in a lot more detail once I get down there. Yeah, a couple of things. So yeah, Jeff, if you can hold on 1 second, we'll get there, and hopefully I'll answer all your frame questions and group questions. So, I'm gonna move this back out of here, and we'll delete this. I'm gonna work in the no land. So a couple of other options you have here is the ability to add strokes. So if I had a library of strokes, as you can see, we're default pulling in some color libraries that we have. I can pull those in here. Same thing with fills. I can adjust these color styles. So these are actually styles that are being pulled in for something else. If I have a style, I can remove it, which gives me nothing because now I have nothing there. Or if I have a style, I can detach it, which allows me to use it, and I can make a slight modification to it if I wanted to. Stroke, pretty standard stroke stuff. Outside, center, inside for where your stroke resides. Just like all other vector tools, if you break the object, so, no. So if I break this object, the stroke will basically, no matter what I set, will always be centered, whether I set it inside, outside, because the object's broken, so the stroke will just be on the center. So this is something to be aware of. I believe every tool works exactly the same. So you can set the stroke color, you can set the width, so we could have 20 pixel stroke on the outside, give us a big black line around it like this. You also have a couple of parameters in here as well. So you can set how your ends behave, but I have corners on here, so let me reset this. So you can set how your corners behave at an angle. Are they rounded? You can set the angle that they are angled out as well. So if you have an object that's like this, you can start to adjust some of these parameters. And it'll change the way those act a little bit. You can also add dashes to here as well. So if you ever need a dash line or anything like that, you can do that in here as well. If there's caps, so let's say we have dashes, I'm gonna make this less obscene. Let's do 2, and let's do 4 and 2. So if you add caps, it'll cap your dashes, or if you have a single line that's a full stroke, it'll cap the ends of that. You can select rounded, you can do square, you can add a line arrow, which doesn't work great on this, but if we just do a straight line, and we add a line arrow, give you little arrows at the end here, and then you can do a triangle arrow for little pointers. So if you're doing like a flow diagram in here, it just gives you a couple of pointers real quick that you can use there. Then underneath your stroke panel, let's go back to removing some of the stuff. You can add multiple layers of objects of these sort of modifiers as well. So I can have multiple fills in here if I really wanted to. So I can have a linear gradient that's red, that's over a gray background. I can have a photo in there as well and set up some parameters for a photo. So let's do... So if I drop a photo in here, you can set what order all these are as well by just clicking and dragging sort of the empty space here. So I can move this underneath the gradient. I can move this gray above. Within an image, you get a bunch of parameters as well that you can adjust, sort of exposure controls, contrast, saturation, temperature. So if you want to do some photo editing in here, this is super light photo editing. Normally you wouldn't edit a photo in here, but if you have to, you can. And you can set how it fills. Do you want it to fit? Do you want it to crop? So you can crop your image, or you can adjust your photo within it. Or do you want it to tile? And then you can set the tiling factor. Let's do like 1%. Or set it back to fill, and it'll just fill the space that's available. So So you kind of do kind of a lot of things in there. Same thing with strokes. If you need a stroke gradient, set this to 0. You can have a stroke gradient, and then you can also have another stroke underneath it, and kind of layer those elements on top of each other. So you can kind of do some interesting things with that.
Here, Billy,
Yeah.
from Aaron, and that all that photo editing will render out in friendly code.
Not really. So the code panel here, it will not give you everything that that you would need, that you would hand off to the developers, because I kind of stacked everything on top of each other. It'll give you some information. It'll say there's a linear gradient in here. It'll say there's an image URL, but it doesn't give you absolutely everything you would need in there all the time. So it does its best. The last element underneath here is the effects panel. So effects, you can, if you have styles saved into a design system, you can bring them in here. But this allows you to do things like drop shadow. You can do a layer blur, a background blur, an inner shadow. So each one of those has different. Let me do this. So like if you wanted to add an effect, if you want to blur out an object, you can just set that into layer blur. So if you want to blur out the background for something like that, or if you want to drop shadow for like a card, you can kind of add that on there. You can also add multiple effects, and you can adjust the effects parameters. So for this drop shadow effect, we have a blur, we have an X and a Y offset, a color, and an opacity that we can adjust, which gives us some nuances there. And you can save these out into the file to be part of your effect styles, or you can save them out in, if it's part of like a UI kit, those would be available to anything that inherits that. The last thing is export settings. This is pretty standard stuff, but it allows you to set your size of export, type of export, JPEG, SVG, PDF. If you want to export just the contents here, give you a preview of what you're exporting. So here you'll see I'm just exporting the content, so it's giving me the background. That's all grayed out. If I turn contents only off, even though it's a PNG and it should have transparency in, it won't. It'll just take whatever's from the background in the canvas and fill that space up. So kind of a nice thing if you did a blur like this and you forgot the corners, at least grab what's ever back there. And you can set multiple export sizes if you want, and it allows you to give it a suffix as well. So for like iOS development, you got to have the @2x, @3x for all the different sizes. And this will scale each one of these objects out. If you're exporting out a vector object, it'll be nice and clean and be appropriate to the size. JPEGs or PNGs will all dependent on the source JPEG or PNG that's in there when it exports out. So you could get some artifacts on like a 3x PNG export if you brought in a low res image. So, any questions or comments on anything so far? All right. Next thing, we'll kind of go over the text tool. So text tool, just T to bring in a text field allows you to drop something in. You can type whatever you want. So we can say hello. Headway. So text tool, just like any other object in here, it'll have a position, it'll have a width and a height, which are important. You can flip things upside down if you really want to, or make them backwards if you want to get real crazy, adjust stuff like that. Give it a rotation as well, so if we want to have our text at a 40-degree angle, we have those capabilities there as well. This will also have the layer capability, so pass through, normal, multiply, light and dodge. If you want to do some more effects-based stuff, you can do that with your text as well. The unique parameters for text allows you to choose your typeface, your different styles for type, or your different weights, so you can have a light, medium, black, so kind of everything that you have in there. Every text that you have installed on your computer will be available in here, and Figma does come with a bunch of presets as well with it. Just kind of stick with Roboto for now. You can choose your size as well. Pretty standard stuff for editing text. So I'll keep that like this. You can choose your line height. So if you have situations like this where it has basically a new line, you can choose how much height you want between those. Letter spacing, so if I want my letters to be further apart, closer together. Paragraph spacing, so this allows you, if you have paragraphs of text in a single text block. Oh, I did not prep for this. And the internet's being slow. So I have a bunch of text in here. And I have 2 paragraphs width. I can adjust the paragraph width here, which will just dynamically push those paragraphs out apart from each other. And I can also give it an indentation as well, so that first line will have an indentation there. So you got a couple of things you can mess around with in your sort of text object. The other thing is your alignments or justifications. If you want things left aligned, center aligned, right aligned, and then justified, which is essentially like book alignment, so everything's sort of full width there. And then where your text sits within sort of the containing block here. So I'm going to do it with this example here. But do I want it to be in the center of my containing block? Do I want it to be at the bottom, or do I want it to be at the top? This becomes really important when you have, we're starting to design reusable components that need to scale for multiple screen sizes. This becomes really important on when you're setting where these different alignments are, and even adjusting them depending on the screen size that you have there. A couple other advanced type options you have here is auto resize. So this auto resizes sort of the frame that your text is in. I can set it to width, and it'll automatically bring it down to the width that's there. I can set it to height. So if I go to height, it'll snap it up here. If I set it to fixed, that means I can change it to whatever I want. So for example, you create a component that only has a text box this big. If you set it to width, in that component, it'll allow the text to overflow that initial boundary that you'd set. You also have some text transformations, like uppercasing, all lowercase, capitalization. You can give it an underline, strike through. So a couple of things that you can do with text here if you need to, and you can turn all this stuff off if you want. And then don't normally mess around with like the font features too much, like fractions. Did not do what I thought I was going to do, but so we don't really use this too much, and a lot of stuff like subscripts and postscripts, we don't have to actually use that a ton. So text can also have stroke on it as well, so you can give your text a stroke, inside, outside, or center. You also can have all the effects and export capabilities on text as well, just like you could an object there. Any questions on fonts or text, typefaces, and anything there? Nope. All right, cool. Then I will keep going. Everyone good here? All right, cool. The next thing is vector networks. So Figma does something kind of unique with their vector tool, which I think is, first, when I took some time to get used to it, I didn't really like it at first, but then once I figured out how powerful it is, I actually like it quite a bit. So Figma creates a vector network, which allows you to really create any shape that you need and intersect at any point where you need to. So for example, if I had just a default square like this and I wanted to make this into like a home icon, I can easily get in here and without too much work, by just dropping in some additional vector points, not that one. I can get in here and create not super great. House icon for like a home on a website. So, and if you ever need to edit this, you can really just kind of get in here and just keep adding stuff to it. So it's really powerful on how you can get in there and really make the changes to your base vector shape. They still have the similar capabilities. So if I were to make a square here and then make a circle here and turn, both of these are technically vectors as well, but you can still, let's see if I mess up this shortcut. So you can still merge these together, and you'll see, like, because these aren't part of the vector network, they have this overlap shape here. So now they are, that's going to look really weird because I have my thing set to inside, but now they're actually part of the same network, and I can really get in here and start to manipulate and make some changes. And I can actually connect these lines to each other if I needed to, from two shapes into making it into a single one. So the vector network is actually pretty powerful, and that's how we do all of our icons and stuff like that. And Figma's got a really good full-blown tutorial on how its full capability set. I probably won't want to dive into it too much here because there's a lot of stuff there that you can do with it. But just want to kind of give everyone a short overview of that. Couple of other tools you'll notice up at the top that when we have objects in space here is we have our edit object, we have the create component, use as a mask, union selection, cropping, and so like resetting an instance. Some of these we'll go over when we create components, we start to actually create a UI kit, but some of these are important for creating masks across the board. So if you're ever doing any sort of masking of an image or anything like that, your mask does need to be below. And masking is really taking a shape, saying these are the boundaries that I want this shape to be. Everything above it is going to be clipped on the outside of these boundaries. So if you have your two layers here selected, so I have my rectangle below, my rectangle above, and I hit use as mask, you'll see the rectangle below is used as the mask, and the color above it is actually being masked out by the rectangle that I have in there. So a lot of times we use this for like cropping out a photo or building out a specific container and masking out a bunch of elements that need to be contained within. Your mask is still a vector shape, so you can actually change this, modify it if you want to round the corners. You have those capabilities in there as well. And I can, give this a gradient. And so I can adjust each one of these independently of each other to really get some unique results. Another tool that we use quite a bit, at least when we're like creating icons and stuff like that, is sort of our union. So these are like sort of standard vector operations that you can do. You can unionize two shapes. You can subtract one shape from another. So if you need to create some icons, as long as you have two vectors selected, right up here, you have the option to do union, subtract, intersect, and exclude. So exclude will remove out the parts that are crisscrossing from each other. Intersect will only display the parts that are crisscrossing. Subtract will take your top object and subtract it from your bottom object. And then the last one is union, which just turns both of them into a single shape that you can move around. Now it'll still keep all the vector shapes underneath in it in this union, so you can actually like add a couple more. if you grab an object and do like an alt drag, you can duplicate in here, and so you can actually still work within this union. It's like non-destructive, doesn't collapse it all down into a single thing. If you want to, you do have the capabilities to collapse it down. All right, cool. Any questions so far? Anything in the chat?
Nope.
All right, cool. All right, so frames and groups. So frames, you'll find yourself right now, like this is a non-ideal workspace. This would be very messy, and we would all probably be very upset if we opened something like this and it looked like this. Really, you try to keep everything in frames. So frames is just press F, and it'll give you your frame tool here. You'll have some preset frames over on the side here. So you'll have different phone sizes, iPhone X, iPhone 8 Plus, SE, tablet sizes, desktop display sizes, Apple Watch sizes, paper sizes, and different social media assets, which is a new thing that they just added recently, which is kind of nice. But you click on any one of these and it'll just drop a frame right into your canvas for you, labeled with the preset that you've selected. You don't have to use those presets. You can just press F and draw a frame out as big as you want, and you can put a frame on there. Kind of a cool thing with frames is frames can be nested within frames. And if you nest a frame within it, it'll lose its title, but you'll be able to see that object. You can still work as like a group and make changes and tweaks to it. So I'm going to show kind of an advanced thing that why nesting frames within frames is actually kind of a good thing real quick. So I'm going to jump over to this intro and Figma file. And when we go to our component library, which I haven't done yet, you'll see on our left nav, it's this lower icon that's 4 little diamonds to make a diamond. You'll see how everything's sorted out nicely in this block elements, blocks, button, modals, navigation elements, showcase images. In Sketch, you used to have to do that with naming it, / give it another name, and it'll sort of, you build out that folder structure in the naming convention. One of the cool things that Figma does is actually in your components area, these are all just frames called navigation elements, and then we have all of our components in there, and then we can still do the sort of file structure naming convention if we have like multiple states. So you can stack those on top of each other and create really nicely organized UI kits by using frames. And it's nice because then if somebody needs to find modals, they can hit Shift-2, select colors, hit Shift-2, and it'll just take them and zoom them right to the spot that's there. Just a way to organize a little bit better. Frames contain a whole bunch of properties that things like groups don't. So if I take these two and I hit Control-G, I'll create a group here. So a group, I can make some modifications to a group. I can give it a background. I can give it a fill color, which will change everything's fill on it. I can also do that in a frame. So you can see I can do a background and I can give it some effects. I can't change the fill color on all the objects within it. Oh, actually, hold on. You can if you have an object in there. So the thing that frames give you that groups don't is a group doesn't allow you to clip the object. So frame up here has this clipping content option. So what that means is if I have my iPhone X and I've got an element that I want off to the side a little bit, it'll actually clip it out for me and act as like a mask. So everything within it will be masked. If you're working really quickly and you're kind of not too concerned about organization, make sure everything's clean, this might be nice for things that are just kind of overflowing on the side. You're dropping a bunch of images in here real quick. So that's kind of nice. Also, frames will allow you to add a grid within it. So right now, in a group here, I'm not able to add any grid item. So when designing out, let's say, iPhone X screen here, I'm actually gonna move it out of here. I can go ahead and create a layout grid right within there. So frames are the only object that'll allow you to do that. When creating a grid, you got a couple options. You've got a pixel grid, You can create a columns or rows if you want horizontal or vertical. This might be kind of hard to see, so let me make these nice and bright. And we'll use these a lot for layouts, especially if you're using things, if you're building off of things like Foundation or Bootstrap, they all have a set of parameters that you want to use. Or if you're getting into just wanting to set up a universal grid for your entire project, you can set up some of these and save them out and use them across the board. So for here, we can adjust the column count. You can give it a width if you need to. We can set the gutter to 8, and we can set the margin to, let's say, 24, and let the width autofill. And now, no matter what size my frame is, I kind of have a grid that follows those parameters that I set. And I set it in the stretch setting, so everything will just kind of stretch along with it. You do have a couple other options. You can do a center grid, which will require you to add a width value. Or you can do left, which will also require you to do a width value. The reason left is really interesting or useful is if you have a project, let's say you have a project that has 2 primary navs on the left-hand side of the screen. You can actually build a 12-column grid for the rest of your screen and offset it and make sure it fits perfectly, and just use the left grid here, and you can give it an offset of like, let's say 60. And you can kind of move it over, and then you have your 12-column grid over there, so you can work in that space, just like you would if you had like a full screen web design. You can also do rows. So if you're trying to set like a vertical rhythm for your entire project, you can set top, center, stretch. Usually I'll set it to top and then set the count to auto. And mainly set it up like this, so kind of follow. So I built myself out a simple vertical grid that kind of follows a loose 8-point grid system and gives me that little vertical rhythm. And you can adjust this when you're placing objects in there. And just like anything else, these can be saved out to your UI system, or they can save it out as the grid styles to their style system, so they can be reusable amongst everyone on the team. Let me see. If you do have frames set on all your screens, Control-G turns them on and off for everyone. Otherwise, you can go in here and turn them on and off as well. On bigger projects, it's nice to be able to turn them all off, leave them on while working, but then be able to turn them all off for presentation instead of trying to go into a component. Because if it's in a component, you can't actually turn it off. You can only remove it from that component. So it's nice to just have that shortcut to turn them all off.
Quick question, David. So,
Yeah.
From Tobias. When do you choose to group stuff instead of framing it?
I fall into the never group anything. Just put a frame in there because it works exactly the same as a group, and it gives you those capabilities. The same capabilities that a group does. So sometimes, like, if I'm working on multiple objects, so like I grab all these and I turn it into a group, and then later, if I need to change it into a frame, up here, I can just set it to be a frame. So you can turn any group into a frame, and you can turn any frame into a group. But I generally try to keep everything as a frame, because even multiple frames allow you to adjust all the different padding elements, like the tidy up and everything like that. So we kind of go over that in a minute here.
Question
Yeah.
from Aaron is it pretty safe to just equate frames to artboards then?
Yes. Yeah. I would say frames are the closest thing to an artboard.
But there are also artboards.
All right. Let me see. All right, so then we'll dive into alignment tools here, and then we'll make just a simple button real quick with everything that we went over, just to kind of show you guys how we might set something up like that. So alignment tools is everything you see up at the top here. A lot of times you have multiple objects selected to have these active, and these are just different ways to align objects, either independently like in Canvas, so I align these on top of each other, which isn't super great. Center vertically with each other, so I can grab two of these, center vertically with each other. Or if I want to, as you notice the padding's all messed up here, I can hit the tidy up button and it'll just equally space everything out. So there's a lot of different alignment options that you can do up with these, which is nice when you're setting up grids of stuff across the board. So sort of the last thing that we need to cover is there are a bunch of shortcuts in the tool. There's some that I tend to use a lot and some I don't use that much because I'm just not super familiar with them. But if you ever want to know where the shortcuts are, there's a little question mark down here. There's a shortcut for the shortcut menu as well. But I want to show everyone where it is. And this will bring up all your shortcuts for everything that has a shortcut. And the nice thing is it'll show you all the shortcuts you've used, which will be highlighted in blue. And the ones you don't use, you can see will be sort of in this grade setting. So kind of nice little menu here to see everything that you have. If you have a weird override, like 1Password that overrides your shortcuts, it will mess up in here and you won't be able to use those. So just a little word of caution. All right, so with everything that we had, if we were gonna build something just real simple, so in our intro to Figma little UI design here, we've got a simple button component. That's a template over here. It's super basic, but definitely want to sort of work through on how we would put this together. So jump back over here. First thing I would do is we would establish a standard button style size. Here we're doing a 128 by 42 was the decision we made for this button here. And so normally I would draw out my frame for that. 140, 128. And we go ahead and name this button. So now the frame is going to be our core container for this button. Like I said, there's a bunch of stuff we can do in here. There's some stuff that we can't do in here. One thing we can't do is round the corners of a frame. So you can't actually do that in the frame itself. So we're not going to use the frame as a thing that renders out the background for us. So we'll just turn that background off right away. What we'll do is we'll actually just put a square or a rectangle right in there and just hit R, drop that in. And make sure that matches up 100%, and we'll call this background. And so this will be our background color for our button, and we'll modify this as we make different states, but this will essentially be the background that we use for everything. We're going to round the corners to 8 here. So now that this is in the frame, the one thing that we didn't really cover is these constraints, and this is going to change how this rectangle or our background operates within the button frame. So the constraints we have here is left and top. So really what that is saying is no matter how this button object scales, so I'm going to just do this because I can actually show it easier. So no matter how this object scales, that button is constrained to the left and top of the frame container. So if I go in here and change the background to right, it jumps over to the right. If I change it to center, it'll be in the center of the frame. If I change it to left and right, it'll scale. And this is different than an actual scale. And we can use this a lot with text tools if we want to keep a consistent padding on the outside of our text. Or I can do same thing with the vertical here, top and bottom, center, top and bottom will scale it out. Scale for this will look exactly the same as top and bottom and left and right. So for this, we'll just keep our background normally to scale. And then I'm going to reset the instance here. So we'll give this a color. We'll make it blue here. And so this will be our background for it. So then we'll press T to drop text in here. So we're dropping text right inside this frame. And as I type, you'll see that this other one that I spawned off here, because it is a component, will will just inherit everything right away. So the text is too big, so we are going to drop it down to 16 pixels. We'll switch it to medium, and we'll actually go smaller. We'll do 12 for this case. So now that this is in, I get these same sort of constraints that I had before for my text here up at the top. Right now it's set to scale, which means as I scale this, it's actually scaling the bounding box that's in here and trying to scale this accordingly. For most text, we don't want to do that sort of scale. What we'll generally do is we'll set up, this actually kind of almost fit perfectly. So I have 24 pixels on both sides here. If you set this to left, right, and then top, bottom, what will happen is it'll maintain that padding on both sides. So let's set this to center. So as I type in here, so it does have to be fixed. So fixed, and then left and right and top and bottom as our constraints. You'll see that it actually keeps the 24 pixels on both sides here. And so if I go ahead and keep typing in text in my button, it'll actually new line before it'll overflow across. If I had this set to width, it'll just auto adjust the width here, and now you'll notice that my padding is no longer that 24 pixels that I had set there. And height in this case doesn't really matter that much. So we can change this to button. You'll notice that because this is a component and I made a modification over here, it doesn't automatically inherit that modification unless I make that change. But we'll go into a lot more deep diving for components later on. Another thing, we'll set we can set the style for the button here as well. So we can set some of these overarching transforms. We'll just change how the button works no matter what across the board. So if we want it to be lowercase, capitalized, transformation to be uppercase, just like we kind of talked about before. And if we wanted to set the opacity on this, we can do that as well. One of the cool things in Figma is you can adjust these within the components themselves, and you don't have to worry about. You can make a change to every element really in here. So I can adjust all of this stuff if I really wanted to in my instance of that button. Even though my template looks wildly different, it's still using the same construction. And you can always reset these back. So, all right, cool. So it's really all we initially planned to talk about for this first dive into Figma, just kind of going over the UI, going over some of the top level things that you can do inside of it, building out just the super basic button. The next session that we plan on having, well, I guess before I jump in, is there any questions, comments in the chat or here? Never group anything, confirmed on stream. Good.
Okay.
From Sam, did you round the corners of the frame or the background rectangle?
You can't round the corners of a frame. You have to do it on the background rectangle. So frame actually doesn't have the options to round corners. Now here you'll see it does because it's inheriting the controls for the object within it, this background. But if I were to remove this background out here, you'll see there's no option around those corners.
Could you go over this, how you got it to scale together again?
The actual constraints for scaling?
Yeah.
Yeah, so for, you know what, this will be an easier example. So let's do this. All right, so if I have this rectangle within this other, in our button rectangle, and I have, right now it's just left top constraints up here. So you select the object inside your frame. And actually, let me do this as well. So this is a frame that's not a component. So if I have this object set as left top, it basically is anchoring this object to the left side of the frame and then the top of the frame. So if I move this up, it's going to pull that object vertically. If I move this to the left, it's going to pull that object to the left. If I go in here and I adjust this to right and bottom, it's anchoring this object to the bottom and to the right of this frame. So if I pull this to the right, move down. If I pull it down, this will move down as well. But if I pull this up, it won't move with it. So my other options are like scale. So I can set it just scale however you want to scale. So scaling, we'll just adjust it to the best it possibly can with the way you're scaling it. But more often, I find using left and right and top and bottom works best for, at least for just buttons where you have centered text, because it maintains the padding that you set for the top and bottom and left and right of that object. So here, it'll still scale, but it's not distorting the padding on the sides, which will happen in a default scale. Also with scaling, if you command scale a frame, so you notice if I grab this here and I scale, I'm adjusting the entire frame, but if you're on a Mac and you command scale, you can move the frame you can move the bounds of your frame without affecting the components within it. So this is really good for resizing. So for example, this component here, I can adjust this frame if I want to without scaling all the objects by holding command and scale, or command and drag.
Another question here, Billy, from Bailey. I missed how you made the 2 button options that related to each other. Do you cover?
Oh yeah, so here, I'm gonna blow this all up. Is this? So when you have an object that's in a frame, you can turn that frame into a component, and we'll dive into a lot of the components and stuff in the next workshop. We'll get really detailed into it. But if you right click on a frame, you have create component option here. And so that creates a button. If you're familiar with Sketch, Sketch will make a symbol. This is the same thing as a symbol in Sketch. Sketch will actually place it in a new page called symbols. Figma doesn't do that, so you do have to have a little bit of organization when you're creating, if you want all your components in a single area. But once you have that component, it'll show up in your component menu here. As you can see, I have 2 button components in here, so you can get it from here and just drag that in if you want, and that'll create an instance of that component. Or if it's in your file, you can alt drag, and alt drag creates a copy, and that'll create an instance of that component as well. So now if I adjust anything on this button, it'll change on any one of these instances. So they'll inherit the changes from here unless I made a customization on this instance. So if I say buy here, and I change this to, that second one won't adjust because I made that change locally to that instance. So.
And then one more question here from Aaron. What's the difference between editing a component in layer view versus the component panel?
So in the layer view here, so if I select this typeface and I type in title, it's just going to rename it. I can't actually change the text by adjusting this here. So this is nice because this is a good way to label everything within your frame, within your component, within your design without it affecting what's on this external text here. However, with text, like the first time you type it in, it will inherit that name there. But I can click in here and I can call it title if I want to, which will give it like a proper label. And I can change the contents in here to and it won't affect any of that there. So really a lot of this is just for renaming stuff or organizing things, or if you want, you can command select objects in here and do operations on them if you need to. So if I had two objects here, instead of selecting them and doing like a shift select in the canvas, I could command select or shift select in here, and then I can do an operation on them as well. So you can make some changes in there as well. Most of the time, you get the size of your object underneath here. So a lot of times I don't do a lot of resizing over here on the side unless I need to be really meticulous with the math. But a lot of times, you can start to build in. You'll notice I have these red dots on the button down below. It's actually snapping to that. So a lot of times when you build out a grid and you have other objects in there, a lot of your resizing can be done just by allowing it to auto snap in between the different objects. Also, you'll notice this for alignment too. You'll get a bunch of red lines showing you that this is the same height, so it's going to align it here. You can also do that for sort of vertical or sort of this horizontal alignment. So if you're just holding, so I did an alt copy to get a copy here, but if I start moving this around, it'll automatically adjust it to be the padding right there, and that's part of that grid snap. So cool. Anything else? All right, cool. Like I said, the next one will go into building out components and building out the UI system. So we'll have something a little bit more like this where you can actually see the local styles. You can see your color styles. You can actually select color styles from across your UI system, building out your components, different screen design. And then the last one will actually be hooking up a full prototype that you can click through start to finish. And we'll kind of show you some of the nuances with the prototype tool and some of the new features they've added. So cool. Well, thank you everyone for taking the time and hanging out with us.